And also, sometimes inclusion isn't always the answer. It's a balance between inclusion and exclusion. Because if you take a photo of everything around you, a photograph of everything is the same thing as a photograph of nothing. If you include too many things in the photograph, it's not going to be clear to the viewer what it is precisely that you want to show. What is it that was in this vast landscape that called your attention? Why did you take the photo? So I would say that in most cases, exclusion is even more important than inclusion. The kinds of things you need to exclude are things that you feel are drawing attention away from your subject, that are going to be distracting, that aren't going to allow people to focus on it. So you need to think while you're composing and looking through your camera, what kind of objects around are not complementing the subject? What kind of things could be distracting? What kind of things give away the context when you don't necessarily want to? You need to know the answers to these questions or else you're not going to know what to do. So again, like I said in the previous chapter, it's very important to have the subject picked out first, because otherwise you're not going to know how to answer these questions and you're not going to know what direction you need to go in order to create your composition. And the mood of a scene can be affected a lot by exclusion or inclusion. Like I said, a lot of times removing the scale of a smaller scene, or of any kind of scene for that matter, can cause it to have a bit more mystery. By excluding everything around your subject, you can create a sense of solitude. Or by including more things, you can create a sense of chaos. Or by including other objects that create a more colorful palette, it can become a more vibrant scene and have a happier, more joyful mood. Or by excluding other objects around your subject that are colorful, making it a monochromatic color palette, it can become a bit more somber, a bit more ominous, and have a darker feeling. So once you have determined what your subject is going to be, what the photograph is going to be about, you need to figure out what kind of things you're going to include and what things need to be excluded in order for people to understand what is it a photograph of, why did you take it. If these kinds of concepts aren't clear, then people aren't going to be impacted as much. You need to have a concept that is very concise and powerful. You don't want to include anything more than you need to, and you also don't want to exclude too much to where it becomes boring and it's not compelling enough because there's nothing else that complements it. Some subjects aren't strong enough on their own. They need other things to add more interest to the scene and make it stand out a bit more. Sometimes you want to remove a sense of scale by not giving anything else that could be compared and give away the size of the subject you're shooting. A lot of times when I shoot very small scenes, I like to not show anything else around them. That way people don't necessarily know right off the bat if it's a small scene or if it's a really wide scene. A lot of times the photographs of very small subjects that I've shot, people think are aerials from really high up. Because there's no sense of scale, there's nothing to compare the subject to that gives away its size. And this can make an image more intriguing, it can make it more interesting because there's this mystery of what it is. It's going to cause people to look at it longer and they're going to be a bit more interested as they try to figure it out. A lot of the times if a scene is too on the nose, if it's too obvious what it is, people are going to lose interest quickly because they're just going to write it off immediately saying, okay, I know what this is. There's no reason to continue to look at it. There's nothing to try and figure out. There's no story that's going to unravel for them. So in my own photography, you may or may not have already noticed that this is one of my favorite types of photographs to create. In the words of my good friend William Neal, I would rather take a photograph that asks questions rather than answer them. So I love to create mystery. I love to make a photograph that makes people think. I always try to make something that's thought-provoking and isn't really identifiable as to what it is at first glance. It takes more time to digest it and it grabs people's attention for much longer than something that's very obvious or on the nose. So I like to be unpredictable and shoot things that I feel most people wouldn't see if it weren't for me having photographed them and showing it to them that way. So for these kinds of scenes where they're a bit more abstract and you're trying to show patterns, you're trying to show a shape or a certain design, this is where exclusion really becomes an important part. So rather than including other things like supporting characters that we covered in the previous chapter, you want to exclude everything else that isn't part of this pattern or this shape or this form or this abstract idea that you're trying to show. So in photographs where you're not taking a photo of a literal object, rather you're taking a photo of its shape or the shape that several different objects make as a whole, you want to exclude anything that doesn't go with this. Otherwise, people aren't going to have their attention drawn to what it is you want them to see. They're not going to be able to distinguish the pattern or the shape or the form or the color that you want them to focus on. They're not going to see that as the subject. So the more you can exclude, the better. Just like always, you only want to include what is necessary, but these kind of scenes that need to be a lot more simplified, they really depend on a lot of exclusion. They're a lot less tolerant of having anything else included that is distracting or that doesn't go with the theme or pattern, because it's going to be right in your face and it's going to be much more apparent than in a wider, grander scene where objects are a lot smaller and there's a lot more noise around them, so they don't really detract as much. So we're going to go over some image examples of patterns and intimate scenes where exclusion was really necessary, because the subject of the scene, like I said earlier, subjects aren't always just a literal object. Your subject isn't always going to be a specific tree or a mountain or a picture of a rock. Rather, it's going to be a picture of an idea, of a pattern, of a shape, more of a design. So it's more about visual elements than literal objects. This is where exclusion really becomes necessary.